You don't have to believe the stories on my blog. You can dismiss them as good hallucinations or bad fiction if you want to, but they're all true. The darkness was never empty. There are things that wait for the innocent and unwary to turn their backs. What is it you think I'm talking about here? Ghosts? Vampires? Ghouls? If only it were that simple. The creatures of the night are still out there, but they're not shadowing your every footstep. They just check your status updates from the comfort of their tombs. All I ever wanted was to be a do-it-yourself style reporter, but more often than I like, I find myself becoming part of my stories. It turns out gods and monsters don't like their secrets getting out any more than your standard politician or celebrity. We all know how this is going to turn out in the end. I'm already long overdue for jail, the loony bin, or a guest of honor spot at a monster buffet. But until that fateful day, I'm not going to back down or give up. My name is Brian Foster, and some people call me the Night Blogger. The Graveyard Game and Other Cemetery Plots, Part 1. The Graveyard Game. She had promised to meet someone at the hole in the chain-link fence. A cautious skeptic that would chronicle the entire event with prose, pictures, and even a little video. They had only met via email and video chats, but she had promised not to start the ceremony without him. But her enthusiasm got the better of her. By the time I found Sarah, she was glassy-eyed and barely breathing. She wouldn't move. She wouldn't react. Not even when I snapped my fingers inches from her nose. I took her hand in mine and started patting her wrist, because that always seemed to work in the movies. Her hand was deathly pale, with well-chewed fingernails and old scars marking the skin of the wrist. As I always did in moments like this, I imagined the voice of my landlady and frequent poster of bail, Mrs. Vincenzo.
"O'Brien, what have you gotten yourself into this time?"
What indeed? After a few more minutes of trying to get Sarah to react, I stood up and pulled out my camera phone. The app for taking pictures at night was already active, so I started snapping away. Click. Sarah Bishop, comatose and staring vacantly into the starless sky. I felt guilty going into reporter mode like this, but experience had taught me to trust my instincts. There's something weird going on, and weird goings-on and straw fedoras are my twin passions. Click. The abandoned cemetery. Toppled headstones partially hidden by knee-deep grass. The Graveyard Game was a ceremony born of the internet. As far as I was concerned, it was half shadowy rumor and half outright lies. But the chatter on my blog had been enough to make me want to see a game for myself, even if just to debunk it. Click. The two candles, one on the tombstone, the other where Sarah had been kneeling. The rules of the game were simple. Find a gravestone that shares your name. Light two candles. One goes at the top of the headstone, the other in front of you. It was that simple, or so they said on the internet. If everything was right, the spirit of your namesake would appear to you. Click. A building off in the distance. Too big to be a caretaker's house. Too square to be a chapel. I wondered how she had found this particular grave. This particular place. The Pinewood Cemetery had been left neglected for almost 40 years. Surely there had been other, more easily found Sarah Bishops out there. Click. Back to Sarah again, sitting up and staring at me. A yelping sound caught in my throat.
Thank goodness you're all right.
She tittered. There was no recognition in her eyes. The twin candles began to sputter and brighten.
It's me, Brian Foster. Remember? We talked on Facebook.
I pulled her to her feet. Still giggling, she swooned into my arms.
I think I should get you home.
Her grin widened. She tugged playfully at the brim of my straw fedora.
I am home.
A tremor of cold worked its way down my spine. I asked,
Which Sarah is this?
Which Sarah?
She laughed out loud and raked her hand down the side of my face. I dropped her. She landed like a cat, then bolted into the shadows and tall grass. The side of my face stung and dripped. I blinked in confusion at the memory of her short, blunt fingernails. The sound of movement surrounded me. The circle of illumination from the candles seemed to be closing in. The thought to run was very tempting. But could I outrun a madwoman? I could sure as hell try.
Foe of radiance and mate of gloom.
Her voice had become a whispering chant.
Howl of dogs rejoicing through tombs of lifeless dust. Gorgo, Mormo, Luna.
My iPhone had a night vision app, so I flicked it on and turned in place. Scanning the area, I found nothing. I wondered if she was crawling through the tall grass towards me, or if she was gone. I wondered if I was going to get home tonight. There was a swift, animal-like movement, then a flare of pain. She had clawed my arm, tearing through my shirt and skin. Panicked, I crashed headlong into the tombstone and hit the ground, bringing the candle down with me. Hot wax scalded my right hand and drowned out the sputtering wick. Sarah shrieked and fell to her knees. We got the hell out of the cemetery and found our way to an all-night donut shop. Sarah told me she didn't remember anything, that all she knew was that she had been blind and cold. Over several cups of lousy coffee, I explained to her what had happened. There was no way she could doubt me. Not when my face looked like I'd just tried to field neuter a badger. The sun is rising and I'm back in my apartment, tapping away at my keyboard. I looked up the little chant I heard. Gorgo, Mormo, and all that. It is an incantation, a calling up of hungry spirits. My face and my arm are still sore to the touch. Had I almost ended up as something's midnight snack? Again? I kept thinking about what she said right before she scratched me. I asked her which Sarah she was, and I thought she was just mockingly repeating my words back at me. But maybe she wasn't. Maybe she was giving me my answer. Had she said which Sarah? Or which Sarah? There's a thought to keep me up nights. August 26th. The powers that be will tell you that none of Albany's buses run after midnight on a Sunday, and anyone who says otherwise is crazy. The problem is that people have seen a city bus prowling the streets in the hours before morning. They say its number is 55. They say its engine growls, its windows are filthy, and the make and model are decades out of date. There are even some folks that say getting onto that bus is the last thing you'll ever do. It was 1 a.m. when I confirmed the existence of Bus 55. I heard it first, coughing and growling its way up the otherwise empty street. Then I smelled it. It was a strange smell, like a combination of diesel exhaust and ozone. The driver was just a shadowy lump sitting in front of the steering wheel, and it was obvious from the speed he was going that either he hadn't seen me,
Or he had seen me and wasn't going to stop. Throwing common sense to the wind, I stepped out into the road. I had just long enough to think to myself that this would be a really stupid way to die. Then the bus had stopped just inches from my nose. I hadn't heard the brakes squeal or the tires screech. The bus just stopped. The vehicle's pneumatic doors slid open with an impatient hiss, and I climbed aboard. There were no interior lights to keep me from nearly missing the top step. The bus driver didn't glance at me as I paid my fare. He just kept glaring out the windshield. I cleared my throat. "Good evening. I had some questions about..." The driver turned and glared at me until I retreated to the back of the bus, cringing every step of the way. There were no other passengers, but I found a seat near the back. Once I sat down, the bus's door hissed to a close, and I was on my way. But to where? I had no idea. I slipped my iPhone from my pocket and snapped a few pictures. Nothing exciting or earth-shattering, just something to do. Something to keep me from worrying that I was heading into terrible danger. Or worse yet, that I was making a fool of myself. The windows were so filthy that I only had the vaguest sense of the scenery passing by. But it seemed somehow to be going by far too quickly for the amount of acceleration I felt. I wondered if that was the big mystery, that maybe some transportation company was testing a new suspension system. After what seemed like an eternity, the bus stopped and picked up another passenger. A stooped figure in raggedy clothes climbed aboard bus 55 and took a seat near the driver. He had his jacket collar pulled up tight around his face. All I could see was tufts of hair. I waited for my fellow traveler to do something, change position, look my way, anything, but he kept still. More miles rolled by, then another stop. 2 more men got aboard, tubby, with ill-fitting suits and bad haircuts. The interior of the bus was still too dark and shadowy for me to make out their faces clearly. I started fussing with my iPhone again, wondering if I could use the low-light photo app to get a better look at their faces. That thought was quickly followed by realization I had no cell coverage. I looked up, wondering what the bus's ceiling was made of. And that was when I realized more stops had been made, and more passengers had been picked up. One of them sat down next to me. The first thing I noticed was his feet, his huge feet dressed in wingtip shoes. The stocky legs that sprouted from those shoes were dressed in pinstripe trousers that had been patched here and there. He had no jacket, but he wore a paisley vest. His face was covered by a thick layer of ash-colored grease paint. He was a clown, and as the other passengers crowded in around me, I realized they were all clowns. But they were not the colorful birthday party performers that probably just popped into your mind. These were sullen-looking monochrome hobos, bleak creatures that had never known a circus tent or a fairground. Who were these people? Were they just coming back from delivering nightmares? Or were they living through nightmares of their own right now? Then the clown sitting beside me flashed a desolate smile and spoke my name. This wasn't the first time the local police found me dazed and wandering the streets of Albany. And it probably won't be the last, but I was glad for the ride home. What happened? How did I get from that phantom bus to our local shopping mall? I have no idea. All I remember, or at least I think I remember, is trying to fight my way to the exit. Clumsy hands grasped at me. Jolly voices made threats and offered candy. Hours of research have left me no closer to any answers. There is no dark secret, no unfinished business or curse. There's no twist in my tale that will make sense of it all. All I can tell you is that there is an impossible vehicle making its way through the darkened streets of Albany, and there's always room inside for a few fools more.
What was it the Firesign Theater used to say? I think we're all bozos on this bus. Maybe I'm the biggest bozo of all. September 4th. A week after playing the graveyard game, Sarah Bishop began sleepwalking. At first, she would find herself standing in the doorway of her house. Then she began waking up further and further down her street. She began sleeping in her clothes and barricading herself in her bedroom. When that failed to stop her wanderings, she started taking sedatives, eventually working her way up to dangerous dosage levels. Then, with all other options exhausted, she called me. I blew it. I had promised Sarah I would stay awake and watch over her, that I would keep her from leaving her house in a somnambulistic state. Instead, I dozed off. It just goes to show you that a 2-liter bottle of Mountain Dew can't compete with the lameness that is Jay Leno's Tonight Show. Once I was sure she was nowhere nearby, I got in my beat-up AMC Pacer and started combing the neighborhood, street by street. I had no luck, and by no luck, I mean that a cop pulled me over for driving suspiciously. Then he gave me a ticket for going 15 miles an hour in a 30-mile-an-hour zone. As I sat there waiting for the cop to write up my citation, I wondered to myself why I even bothered. If you're one of my longtime readers, you know I'm no hero. And truth be told, I'm a pretty lousy paranormal investigator. I've never managed to get a scrap of real evidence. My photos rarely come out, and when they do, my camera phone usually ends up getting confiscated by the local PD, or broken, or both. All I ever end up with is another gray hair and another story for this blog. How many of you reading this really believe me? How many of you take me at my word? When the ticket had joined the others in the glove compartment, I started driving again. But this time, instead of creeping around Delmar, I headed for the Pinewood Cemetery, the place where this nonsense had begun. The idea that Sarah would be there was one of my loopier notions. The abandoned graveyard was at least 20 miles away. It would take her hours to get there. But still, I had a hunch. A blogger's intuition, you might say. While I wasn't surprised to see Bus 55 zoom past me as I turned onto Hardin Boulevard, I wasn't too happy about it either. I parked my car in a secluded spot and headed for the hole in the fence. I found Sarah at her namesake's grave, clawing through the dirt with her bare hands, all the while whispering to herself under her breath, "Gorgo, Mormo, Luna." At first, I tried to call her name, but she didn't notice me. I had to lift her up by her shoulders and give her a good shake to get her to snap out of it. It took her a few moments to realize where she was, but once she did, there were tears in her eyes. Sarah stared at her broken and dirt-caked fingernails. "What's happening to me?" "I don't know," I said. But I was starting to have some suspicions. Suspicions I didn't want to share right then. But let's try to find out. We got back to my car as fast as we could. I told her to wait there, then I went to the back of my car. The rear of the AMC Pacer is not quite a trunk and not quite a hatch. What did I keep there? If asked, I'll claim it's where I store the tools of my trade. But really, it's just a pile of random junk I keep around in case of... well, in case of something. After a minute or so of rooting around, I found my shovel and headed back into the cemetery. I stood over the other Sarah Bishop's grave for a moment to gather my courage. Then I started digging. As my longtime readers will know, this wasn't my first time doing this. Not by a long shot. I worked as fast as I could and tried to keep the sides of the hole from caving in. Around about the time exhaustion had nearly overtaken me and my back was screaming in protest, my shovel hit something hard. Now the real fun began. Straddling the casket, I used the shovel to crack and smash the lid open. Thankfully, the wood was old and rotten, and it came apart like the skin of a rotten fruit. I screamed at what I found. A shrill little scream they probably heard 3 counties over. I clenched my eyes shut and then looked again, but there was no denying it. There was no human being buried in this grave. It was a statue of a woman with her face split in 3. One part was bestial, the second reptilian, and the third was smooth and blank. "Gorgo," a voice said from above me. "Mormo, Luna, thousand-faced moon." I looked and saw Sarah staring down into the grave. It took me longer than before to get Sarah to return to her senses. Then she immediately became hysterical. Not that I blame her. Before I filled the grave back in, I smashed the statue to bits in one of my standard acts of futility. I took Sarah back to my apartment above Vincenzo's pawn shop and did the best I could to nursemaid her. She's asleep now, and I'm sitting here trying to figure out what the hell I'm going to do. This is a possession, plain and simple. There is no ghost or phantom or girl in the grip of a really creative delusion. Gorgo, Mormo, Luna, thousand-faced moon. What are you, and how am I going to stop you from adding Sarah's face to your collection?
The Night Blogger was written and produced by Al Bruno III. Production assistance was by Brian Mancy. The voice of the Night Blogger is Brian Mancy. Music was by Josh Bruno. For more internet tomfoolery, stop by albruno3.blogspot.com, and while you're there, why not consider clicking the donate button? Your support really helps.